Good morning again, everyone. Um, Following on Eric's conversation about slavery, if I were to summarize my paper, obviously my paper is on temporary marriage. My conversation is mostly with Professor Afari on her book on sexual politics. But following on the conversation that Eric just had with you, and I hope this is taken in the proper context in which it is offered. Not all slavery is slavery. Not all temporary marriage is temporary marriage. Or not all temporary marriage is therefore by definition negative, even though I do not wish to follow up with this by saying not all slavery is negative. Clearly, there is an opprobrium on the notion of slavery that cannot be effaced and erased under any circumstances. But what I'm asking for is for nuances. In the case of some of the examples of slaves at the court of my ancestor, Fath Ali Shah, and examples on the courts of subsequent rulers, and then aristocratic families all the way down to the Pahlavi era. When we look at the notion of slavery, we need to distinguish this from what is most familiar to Americans, obviously, the context of slavery in America, which was mentioned by Dean Majewski, which is a very different institution altogether. But again, with the caveat, and God help me if this is misunderstood, with the caveat that I am not excusing slavery or trying to make light of it. I'm just asking for nuances of interpretation and observation. In the case of some of the slaves that were bought and were either entered the harem of Fath Ali Shah or entered as domestic labor, there is a differentiation there too. Some of the examples given obviously refer mostly to African slaves, that is, slaves of African origin. But as you well know, there was also slavery and slave markets, particularly in Istanbul and in the Ottoman realm, of white slaves from the Caucasus. And some of the wives in the harem of Fath Ali Shah were indeed Caucasian slaves. His senior son, Muhammad Ali Mirza Dawlat Shah, was the son of such a captive who had entered the harem of Fath Ali Shah. It became a problem for succession in that Fath Ali Shah did prefer his first son. He was a vigorous warrior and distinguished himself not only in battle but also in terms of administration. And one of the reasons why in the end he could not succeed in becoming the next Shah, he predeceased his father for one thing, but for another there was competition amongst the senior brothers, and one of the weak points of his claim to the throne was indeed that he was the son of a slave who became a temporary wife of the ruler, unlike the other senior sons who were sons of permanent wives. So I just wanted to introduce this as a first notion that I'm asking for some delineations and for a subtler distinction among these categories before we run away with the notion that everything is the same and everything is equally negative. The gods have an interesting way of giving one favors. This morning as I was checking my news feed, there was an article from Time magazine on my news feed entitled, "Women Achieved Enormous Power in Ancient Egypt. What they did with it was a warning for today." This is from yesterday's Time magazine by Professor Kara Cooney at UCLA, who is an expert on ancient Egypt and the queens of ancient Egypt. So if I may, I would like to read three paragraphs from this article, and I couldn't have wished for a better introduction to what I was going to be saying. She says, "I study women and power in the ancient world, having just written a book on 6 queens of ancient Egypt. Their stories reveal a troubling and difficult aspect of female power in history, and one worth keeping in mind today. Though a high number of women in positions of power is often seen as a marker of progress in governments and corporations, history shows that what matters is not how many women rise to that level, but what they do once they get there. And then she concludes with these two paragraphs. The Egyptian female king was only allowed to enter the political fray for a short time to support the male-dominated system around her. Her memory and legacy were erased afterwards if she's successful, or mistakes aggrandized as a cautionary tale if she was a failure. Female power was forced upon people during moments of great crisis like kingly succession, civil war, or imperial aggression, but only when all hope for a male leader was lost. For the Egyptian system of divine kingship, women were actually the best choice to maintain the status quo, because their caretaking for family could be so easily turned into protection of the patriarchy itself. And that is the tragedy of female power that the Egyptian female kings whispered to us from the past. Breaking glass ceilings is one thing, but until women can act with their own agendas, most women in power today, as yesterday, are just serving the status quo. This is the position that radical feminism does, in fact, espouse. And I would like to add to this, yes, there is no argument with this. There is no argument with this. There is only one solution to breaking the structures of patriarchy, and the solution is the solution offered by Karl Marx. It has to be a complete revolution. Anything else, anything short of that, is adding water to the mill. If one works in the capitalist system, whether one is an opponent or whether one is a critic, one still adds water to the mill. If one works within the patriarchy, one still adds water to the mill. So, short of that radical solution to the radical problem, I stand here before you to want to say that there is still a meaningful discussion on gradations. And the institutions that we observe and that we talk about must be taken at different levels and must be looked at in their own right. So as I was reading about what Professor Cooney is mentioning in terms of the female queens, or as she says, Egyptian female kings, I was thinking, those of you who are experts on Iran, I was thinking of Mahdi Awliya, the mother of Nasruddin Shah, and the negative image that she has in history, because she was a strong queen, and then also a strong queen dowager. And also the image that we have of Malek-e-Jahan, the wife of Muhammad Ali Shah, the second to last king of the Qajar dynasty, and how maligned she is in history, and how much she tried to keep both the dynasty together, and then, as the dynasty was in exile, to keep the family together. So, as I said, it couldn't have been a better article. I would not have been able to write it, certainly, but it could not have been a better introduction to what I'm actually saying. And so, as I said, this is, in a sense, easy to speak to you because you're an audience that is are experts on matters of harems and on matters of temporary marriages and on matters of slavery, so I'm not speaking to an audience of novices on this matter. But there are still certain difficulties here. For one, we're speaking about an institution, the institution of temporary marriage, which has no equivalent in the West. For another, we're speaking of a harem, a structure, although not unfamiliar to the West, from its encounters with the East, it also has no counterpart in the West. And lastly, we're speaking of structures and institutions distanced from us in time by centuries, even though both still exist in the East, as witnessed by the reaffirmation of Sireh marriage under the Islamic Republic of Iran and the continuation of the harem in today's Arab kingdoms of the Persian Gulf, and even beyond that to states in Southeast Asia and to modern-day Africa. Obstacles to a dispassionate discussion of temporary marriage, which is the topic I'm focusing on, and the harem, exist to the near universal opprobrium attached in the West to the notion of temporary marriage and to the concomitant trope of concubine as a designation for the women in that relationship, rather than the more neutral term temporary wife. Additionally, the greatest hurdle to a neutral discussion of both temporary marriage and the harem comes from the critiques of these institutions, both from the colonial and neo-colonial discourse on the right and from the feminist and radical feminist critique on the left. It goes without saying that contact with the West brought the inadequacies and shortcomings of traditional structures of the Middle East more into focus. The colonialist and neo-colonialist narratives, as well as the feminist and radical feminist critiques of the harem and temporary marriage, helped to draw this out, and both had indigenous as well as foreign champions for their narratives. Yet, in a sense, both these critiques are two sides of the same coin, as they both fail to see the institutions of temporary marriage and the harem as responses to political, social, cultural, and religious realities of the time, with evident flaws to be sure, but also with rationales that did not necessarily ipso facto include and imply the oppression of women or the backwardness of the East, necessitating it thus to be rescued from itself by the supposedly advanced and more modern West. And lastly, while discussing temporary marriage in the context of 19th century Iran, which is the focus of this paper, a further muddying of the waters occurs in transitioning from a discussion of temporary marriage as an institution at the court and in aristocratic houses to that found in the general population and in the lower classes, followed by a subsequent equating of the two as inherently alike and equally odious. There is no question that the institutions decline over time, and also that institutions get subverted and abused to such a degree that the original intent and rationale behind their founding becomes opaque. It is an undeniable fact that time, distance, and context often distort institutions almost beyond recognition. Thus, while it is perfectly legitimate to evaluate an institution based on its potential for abuse, it is not legitimate to judge it entirely by the fact of that abuse by some or even by many in a different age, under different circumstances, and with different moral, social, political, and ethical compasses from those prevalent at the inception of those institutions. The harem, then, and the institution of temporary marriage must become the focus of our conversation to show that both must be seen in a different light. There is no denying that the harem was not always an ideal place for its occupants, and there is no denying that temporary marriage was not always an ideal union for the women in the equation. In an ideal world, from our perspective today, no harems would exist and no marriages would be marriages of convenience to serve only one party. But our criteria from our perspective today must not be a measuring rod against which we measure institutions belonging to a different time and corresponding to different exigencies and demands of that time. Institutions must be looked at within their own contexts and must be shown as falling short on their own standards at that time for the criticism to be valid. No institution can withstand criticism at all times under different standards from those under which it was created in the first place. If our criterion is equality, the harem and temporary marriage definitely fall short and fail. If our criterion is power and opportunity, both institutions do come out in a different light, as many scholars have pointed out. Considering the time and place, women without independent means had few, if any, opportunities other than marriage. Considering the options, few women would have refused the chance of being married to the ruler of the time and thus be at the pinnacle of power, despite the fact that power ultimately was not theirs personally, but could be theirs through the offspring or through internal mechanisms of the harem itself. Considering the options also, few women would have passed up the opportunity for a life without financial cares, even if that opportunity did not provide the same freedom that of the master of the harem had. For these reasons, it is necessary, I say, to take a closer look at the notion of temporary marriage, or sireh, and the structure of the harem at the court of the early Qajars, particularly that of Fath Ali Shah, to be able to provide a different perspective and possible alternate narrative to that of the descriptions of the decline at the court of his great-grandson Nasruddin Shah, and the further decline of the practice of sireh both at the Nasiri court and in the general population of the time, and continuing today in contemporary Iran, as outlined excellently in Professor Afari's pioneering book, Sexual Politics in Modern Iran. And I'll leave the rest for our discussion. Thank you very much.